Hello and welcome to the first episode of History Bubble Australia, a country and continent where writing has only existed for about 2.5 centuries, and before that it was a nomadic tribal society with little knowledge of alga culture, pottery or metalworks. This episode of History Bubble will give you a glimpse into the pre-colonial Aboriginal society of Australia. First human arrival to Australia occurred between 30 and 50,000 years ago and happened by sea, making it the only continent to receive its first humans on a boat. This journey over the sea was not as long as it's been today, since all of the greater Sunda Islands, except Sulawesi, were connected by land. The rest of the way, the Aborigines island hopped between the isles of Lesser Sunda Islands and then onto Australia, as that continent was also larger back then and was very close to Timor. They soon started to spread out over the newly discovered island, and in a few centuries all of Australia, including Tasmania. The Aborigines had brought with them half-wild dogs called dingoes on their canoes, making this one of the first times humans introduced a new species to an entirely foreign ecosystem. The dingo might have led to the extinction of several native Australian species that later only survived on Tasmania, such as the Tasmanian devil and Selekane. But there are other factors that might be responsible, such as a changing climate or the other new species on the island, Homo sapiens. These humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, separated into many tribes by the time of colonization. These tribes were differentiated mostly by language and to a lesser degree territory and religion. It is hard to know how many different tribes there were, since the languages were very similar, especially inland, where many tribes could communicate with one another. That complicates things, since each tribe had no formal leadership, with most members having as much authority as any other. The elders had some power, since they were the ones who educated others and told them stories, but this was quite indirect, and does not make them even close to being leaders. The different tribes regularly came into conflict with each other, over resources, territory, or even people. To avoid such conflicts, tribes often gave away their women, unwillingly, to rival tribes to strengthen relations or avoid war. And if the conflict escalated, women often became prisoners and husband to the victors. This is not the only way women were discriminated against, and from birth to death they almost had no rights, as they were one of the few things an Aboriginal man could call property. From birth, they are owned by their male relatives until their marriage, which often was arranged at birth at a very young age. Those who disobeyed their men were often beaten or even spared. There was little they could do about it, since the rigid social divisions of labor, Aborigines, made men do all the physical work, such as hunting and spearfishing, while women gathered roots, plants, and fish with their nets. The hunting was mostly done by spear or axe, since more suitable weapons, such as the bow, had not been invented. This meant that the Aborigines needed to compensate for the lacking technology by having extreme physical abilities, such as their incredible spear throwing ability. The average Aborigine could throw a spear 30 to 50 meters with striking accuracy, just about half the world record, which is with a much better javelin, at a better angle and with less accuracy. They also were incredible trackers and stalkers. They could stand still for hours waiting for the prey to gather enough courage to move out of hiding, to then strike it dead. Other accounts describe Aborigines who lay naked in the sun with fish entrails on their belly, waiting for a bird to take the food, and they captured it while it flied past. Their eyesight was also much better than modern humans, as well as their memory, as without writing they had to rely on their mind to memorize everything, from each species' living pattern to the geography of the terrain. The spears were also used by the coastal tribes for fishing, as the nets and hooks produced by the Aborigines were too weak to hold fish for more than a few seconds. The nets and hooks made out of seashells were still useful for luring fishes with bait to then be speared to death by another. This made it so the Aborigines always fished in pair to make it more effective. To get far enough out of shore to find a lot of fish, canoes were used. They were fragile crafts compared to the Polynesian or Native American canoes, but fulfilled their purpose, as their light and simple structure made them easy to build and carry, suited a nomadic lifestyle. The canoes even sometimes had a burning fire on them to cook the fish as soon as it was caught. The abundance of food in the coastal regions of Australia was both an advantage and an indirect disadvantage to the tribes residing there. Since they did not have to worry as much about getting food, they could create tools and other necessities quite easily themselves, making them live a more isolationist lifestyle than the more inland tribes, who traded more and had a more homogeneous language. This made war less common as trade increased intertribal relations and made them slightly more advanced. But the Aborigines were still some of the least technologically advanced people on a substantial landmass the Europeans had encountered on the colonial adventure. They built no huts or tents and preferred to sleep on the ground or in caves. Neither did they have clothes and ran around naked in the Australian bush. Their social advancements was also minimal, as they had little to no perception of property nor social divisions. Their treatment of babies and toddlers also showed their ruthlessness. If a woman died in childbirth, her child was killed, and if a mother died before her child could walk, the child was killed, and if the child had any form of deformity, it was killed. This was because it was too much of a hassle to keep the child with them, if not the caring mother was there with it. A woman could not handle 2 babies at the same time, so if she became pregnant with a child at arms, an abortion needed to occur. They had many methods for this. Firstly, they tried to use herbal medicine, and if this did not work, they would beat the woman's belly in hopes of killing the child, and if this was not enough, the child would have its head crushed as soon as it was born. Their primitive nature is also shown in the sense of hygiene, as they never washed and instead used the entrails of fish to cover themselves. The stench of rotten fish scared away most insects, so it did somewhat help for their protection from diseases. This primitive lifestyle could survive for millennia, isolated from the outside world, where their only competition was the local wildlife. But as soon as a more advanced civilization arrived with the intention of staying, the status quo that had existed for tens of thousands of years would fall to ruins in a few decades. And how and why that will happen will be the subject of the next episode of History Bubble, and I hope to see you then.